So I have the great pleasure of being able to introduce my former boss, Secretary Carlos Gutierrez, who will be joined on stage by one of our favorites here, Harold Ford Jr. So here's a little story about Carlos Gutierrez. In late 2004, those of us who were working for President Bush at the Commerce Department were wondering who our new boss was going to be, who President Bush would select as the new Commerce Secretary. When we heard it was going to be Michigan-based CEO of Kellogg, Carlos Gutierrez, our collective reaction was, Now, don't get me wrong, we knew all about Carlos Gutierrez. We knew he was a celebrated CEO. We knew he was the guy that Time magazine called the guy who fixed Kellogg. We knew he was the guy who led Kellogg into global expansion focused on high-margin products resulting in record profits. And we knew he had a stellar reputation. So what was the rub? We're thinking big shot CEO. No Washington experience. No political background. We've seen this movie before. It doesn't end well. Well, when Carlos Gutierrez came to town, our fears were not only dispelled, they were completely blown away. Disarming, charismatic, incredibly quick, and understood intuitively how to get things done in Washington. He immediately became President Bush's go-to guy on a host of tricky issues. For the unprecedented expansion of free trade agreements, for the rebuilding of the Gulf Coast after Hurricane Katrina, the response to the credit crisis of 2008, to prepare the nation for the 2010 decennial census, even dealing with wayward, lost satellites in space. Now, he looks like he walked straight out of central casting. It's like someone said, get me someone who looks like a cabinet secretary, and he does. But his approachable manner, his sense of humor, quickly won over staff, the public, and members of Congress. Carlos Gutierrez's American story starts in Cuba, where he was born. But he left that country when he was 6 because his family was too prosperous for the Castro regime. His first job was selling Kellogg cereal out of the back of a truck in Mexico City. It is these experiences, plus his years running Kellogg's businesses overseas, that made him the perfect choice for President Bush to turn to in 2005 to lead the fight for comprehensive immigration reform. And it was a fight. The Secretary, the President, and the team rolled up their sleeves, developed proposals, worked personally with members of Congress day in and day out, and to their credit, stuck with the issue, kept pressing the issue, even when the political pundits realized that the political will to make the necessary changes our country needs to make simply was not there. But they kept at it because it was the right thing to do. And now, almost 8 years later, we know it was the right thing to do because we're still dealing with this issue of how we fix our immigration system today. So it is my great pleasure to welcome back to Michigan my former boss, the former CEO of the Kellogg Company, and the 35th Secretary of Commerce, someone who I have the utmost respect and gratitude for. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Carlos Gutierrez.
Thank you, Sandy. That was incredibly generous. That was very nice. It is a real honor to be back in Michigan. I owe a lot to Michigan. This is where I sort of made it in the business world and spent 3 stints in Battle Creek, Michigan. So I love this place. And my kids grew up here. My family loves it. One of my daughters is born here, so great to be back. I also feel very privileged and very much at the right time in the right place, speaking about immigration in a state where you have a governor who understands immigration and who sort of gets the link between immigration and the economy. And that's what I'd like to talk about today, and put it in the context of what's going on in Washington and the new Senate bill and what that's going to mean and how far it goes, and what more we need to do. Starting out on immigration? Why immigration? Why is it such a big deal? Is this all about the 11 million undocumented? Why are we doing this? Very simple reason. We have some demographic challenges coming at us, and coming at us very quickly. And if you look at how economists measure GDP growth, it's very easy. It's a very simple formula. The number of people who are working and the productivity of those people. So if you're not growing your workforce, you have to grow through productivity, which is one heck of a challenge to do. So demographics and growth are tied intimately. The demographers talk about a fertility rate. The fertility rate that we need to be able to maintain our population is 2.1 births per adult woman. Our current fertility rate is 1.9. So without immigration, our population would decline. And we all know, and you know it in a big way, just looking at Detroit, what happens when a population starts declining. So we are at that stage where we've got the same situation. Our working age population is growing at about 0.3%. So even today, if we want to grow at 4%, and 4% is a viable growth target, we can grow at 4%. We're going to have to do it all through productivity, because we just don't have the number of people entering the working age population. That may sound a little bit odd because we have 7.5% unemployment, but those are the facts. We had a great period of time. Economists call it the era of moderation, from 1980 to 2007. We had some ups and downs. We had some bad periods, but overall, you look at that period of time, and it was pretty good. And a big part of what was driving that was the baby boomers getting into middle age and getting into working age. The stock market grew incredibly. The housing market boomed. It was a good time. Problem is, we talk about it sometimes as if though we're just waiting for the recovery. It's a matter of time. It's going to come back. Problem is that those people who drove that era of moderation, instead of buying big houses, they're now buying small empty nests. Instead of buying stocks, they're actually reducing their exposure to stocks because, they want to have cash. So where is the catalyst? Why is the economy going to come back in a matter of a couple of years? And that's where I submit to you that immigration comes in hand. And I haven't even mentioned entitlements and how we're going to pay for those entitlements, and the fact that we've got, not enough people entering the workforce to pay for the entitlements of people who are retiring. So we have a demographic problem, and that's the first reason to be interested in immigration. If we look at low-skilled workers, 1960, 50% of our workforce did not have a high school degree. 50%, 1960. Today, it's 8%. So jobs that people used to take, people who didn't have a high school diploma, all of a sudden don't have enough workers. What kinds of jobs? Agriculture, construction, hospitality, hotels, restaurants, healthcare, logistics, transportation. I mean, you name it. We don't have enough truck drivers. We don't have enough construction people. We don't have enough nurses' aides. It's just not the way our population is developing. To give you a sense of what foreign workers can do with our economy, there's a lot of discussion about, and I get the question a lot, you know, aren't foreign workers, immigrants, going to come and take our jobs? The answer is no. They're going to come and create jobs. Several studies cite that for every 100 immigrants who come to the country to work, 40 jobs are created for US citizens, which is an amazing thing. If you look at the high-skilled side of things, a quarter of all US corporations were started by an immigrant. You look at the big corporations, go back to their history, 25% started by an immigrant. Today, 1/2 of all new high-tech startups have at least one immigrant founder. So you talk about jobs and the ability to drive growth. There's a lot of criticism about, you know, a certain high-tech company that took their R&D center to Canada. What do you expect them to do if they couldn't find the people in the US? They've got a responsibility to shareholders. And these are the types of things that are happening. Let me give you just some high-skilled facts. 1 in 4 doctors, immigrants. 2 in 5 medical students, immigrants. 1 in 3 computer software engineers, immigrant. 1 in 5 post-secondary teachers, immigrant. 1 in 4 PhDs, immigrant. That shouldn't make us feel bad. We have always relied on immigration to get the best scientists in the world. And it's no different today. So immigration is an issue of competitiveness. It is an issue of economic growth. It is an economic issue. It is an issue of how are we going to grow. It's a strategy. Unfortunately, as you well know, we have a tendency of turning economic issues into political issues. And that's what immigration has become. It's one massive, complicated, messy political issue. And it's often just, you know, turned down with one-liners. It's amnesty. They're going to create jobs. They're going to take American jobs. It's just businesses trying to get cheap labor. That's it. One sentence does it all, and you throw it out the window. This is what they're working on in the Senate today is an 800-page bill. And I find it very difficult to dismiss an 800-page bill with one word or one sentence or one concept. But that's sort of the way, that's where we are as we think about immigration. We're not the only country facing these problems. Think about Japan. I mean, Japan, they've got a massive demographic problem. What they don't have is experience with immigration. They just, I mean, they've never had a history of immigration. So it's not like they can tap into their, you know, their knowledge and their experience and their wisdom. And they're going to have a tough time. 10, 20 years from now, Japan is not going to be what it is today unless they figure out a way of doing something about their workforce. One ace in the hole that they have is perhaps having more women in the workforce, which today they don't have enough, but that's probably the only thing they can do. Russia's population is already declining. And I'll tell you, a declining population means a declining economy. There really isn't, you know, other ways to think about it. Italy, I mean, once known for big families, they're having a problem creating a workforce that can grow. And a lot of Europe, I mean, Europe is turning to the Middle East for their immigration. Not that that's a bad thing, but it's a little bit more difficult to integrate sometimes. At least what we all read is that Europe is having a tough time integrating immigrants because they're just so different. We don't have that problem. We've never had that problem. I'll tell you countries that understand this and that are eating our lunch when it comes to immigration: Canada, New Zealand, Australia, They have been updating their systems. They recognize this is an economic strategy, and they have got 21st century immigration systems. Our laws go back to, some of them to the 1960s, some to the 1950s. A lot of our philosophy about immigration goes back to, the middle of the last century. So somehow we haven't kept up. The land of immigrants hasn't kept up with immigration. It's unbelievable. So the good thing about it, the good news is there's a group of 8 in the Senate, and they're working on an immigration bill. They just got it through committee. They had some amendments that's going to the Senate now, and eventually there'll be a House bill, and hopefully we can get some reform. And I'd like to talk to you about that reform and put it in the context of what it means for the economy and what we still need to be doing. There are 3 pieces to the reform. And I'm going to boil it down and try to simplify and try to summarize, because it is an 850-page bill. First thing is border security. The second thing is, what do you do about 11 million undocumented? The third thing is, what is the new system? What is our new 21st century immigration system? So border security. Everybody talks about border security. And it's a little bit of a misnomer, because border security is the border, but 40% of the undocumented folks who are in the country came in through an airport. They just overstayed their visa. So border security does include the border. It includes a system to monitor who has overstayed their visa, who is in the country that shouldn't be here. We've got the technology to do this. And it also includes a workable system to verify new employees. And the business community has concerns with this, because it's got to be a very good system to be able to verify that people's Social Security numbers really do match the person. And that can be done. So there's a good system to fix what people call border security. The problem with this is that, and you've probably all heard this, that in 1986, when President Reagan did his reform, which people refer to as Reagan's amnesty, the big problem is that we didn't secure the border. And that's why we've got these problems today. I don't agree with that. And everything that we see suggests that, yes, the border is partly responsible. There's no question about it. And we should not be apologetic about the fact that we're going to secure our border. We're going to make it tough for people to come in illegally. We have the right, we have the responsibility to do that. But we cannot blame everything on border security. And the more we do that, the more we talk ourselves into a false solution. It's a little bit like in business. We've all been through this. When you solve the wrong problem, it's like if the only thing we do is build a 500-foot fence, a 1,000-foot fence, we're solving the wrong problem. And we're kind of missing the big picture. The real problem we have, and the reason we have 11 million undocumented folks primarily, it's not the only reason, is that we have a legal system that doesn't work. And until we recognize that, we're just going to continue to be dysfunctional. We're going to continue to struggle with immigration. And there isn't enough discussion about that. The discussion today is about what do we do about the border? The discussion today is about the 11 million undocumented, but there's very little talk about where do we go from here? What is our 21st century system? How do we update our system so that it is also a competitive advantage? I'll give you one example. The design of our current system has about 7% of the visas going to skills, people who come in to the country because of their skills. Canada is 25, Australia is 41. Our system is based on family reunification, which is not a bad thing. The only issue is that our definition of family is pretty broad. So, my wife and I come in and we bring our kids. But my wife brings her sister. And her sister brings her husband. And her husband eventually brings his cousin. And his cousin brings his wife. It's a chain, what they call chain migration. And many of the folks who come in don't necessarily match up with the skills that we need. So that's one of the reasons that our system is so outdated. It was started at a time when, China was in the Cultural Revolution, and the Soviet Union was not an economic competitor. So we had the luxury of saying, let's just, family reunification, that's all we need. We need to do better than that. We can still have a family reunification system, but that 7% is too low. So the new legislation that's being considered, today we have a cap of 65,000 high-skilled workers, H-1B visas. That's being taken up to 115,000. The 65,000 number was taken up in the first 5 days of just about every year. I think there was one year where it took us to February. But, it snapped up like that. 115,000, maybe it'll get us to March, maybe to June. But the point is, it's a great step forward. And this group of 8, I commend them for their leadership. But we need to be having a conversation about this. Is 115,000 enough? Or are we going to still have a gap whereby companies are still going to have to go to Canada to build their R&D centers? The construction. The new system has a cap of 20,000. It's better than no cap. It's better than saying no construction people. My God, 20,000? I think we need 20,000 in Miami, maybe Florida. But 20,000 construction workers for the country? We're just asking for trouble. Agriculture. The cap that's been set, and by the way, these caps will grow. But the point is that we're starting out with a pretty low cap, 112,000 in agriculture. Most studies you see will say that you need anywhere from 400,000 to 500,000 annually. But we're just telling the ag folks, we have decided that your number is 112,000. And I'll tell you something, what's happening in agriculture is sad. We don't pay a lot of attention to agriculture because it's down to 2% of our GDP. But we have got, we export agricultural products. It's a big part of what we do export. But we have put a burden on our farmers like you wouldn't believe. Family farms are going out of business. Big farms are going out of business. I was down at a farm in Florida last week, and the owner was saying, look, I said, do you export? Heck, of course I don't export. If I had more workers, I could export. And then I can open up more DCs. And if I opened up more DCs, I would give jobs to more US citizens. And this is why this low-skilled dynamic of the low-skilled workers actually create higher skilled jobs. The farmers who want to do it the right way have to go through a tremendous bureaucratic ordeal, and then they end up paying more so that they're at a disadvantage with those farms that hire illegally. So they're in a no-win situation, and it's very sad because it's like nobody is listening. No one is listening. And the question is, what is it going to take? Are we going to just say we're going to import all of our food from overseas? How do you like that? How do the American people feel about that? How does Congress feel about that? Well, we feel terrible about it. Then why the heck aren't we doing something about these immigration visas for agricultural workers? And by the way, there are farms already that have moved to Mexico. I was talking in a different industry, but I was talking to a restaurant owner the other day, which just, this put this so clearly. He said, look, today I own 3 restaurants. If I had enough workers, I would own 8 restaurants. And with those 8 restaurants, I would hire more US citizens. I'd have a manager, I'd have a buyer, but I can't find the workers that are the foundation for the restaurants. You can take that example and multiply it by hundreds of thousands. And that's what's happening in the country. That's exactly what's happening throughout the country in every state, in small, in medium, and large businesses. So the real issue that we should be concerned with is, what is the new legal system? So you have your reform, and you've got all your Washington, D.C. debates on citizenship or undocumented and amnesty and border security. That's all great. But where do we go from here? What is our strategy? And I'll tell you, until we do that, we're going to continue to have illegal immigration. We're going to continue to see businesses close. We're going to continue to see businesses move overseas. Or we're going to continue to see underperforming businesses, which essentially lead to an underperforming economy. Unless we recognize, we face the reality that we need more immigrants. How do you fill the gap? So the new bill is great. It is a step forward. It is a wonderful thing. I commend this group of 8 who have taken the risk of putting this thing forward. But the point is, the quotas are too low, the caps are too low, and the bureaucracy is too high. What you have to do to certify that you can't find a U.S. citizen for that specific job is tremendous amount of paperwork, tremendous amount of time, and it just makes our system work against us. There is a commission, a new commission that will be set up by cabinet officers, and they're supposed to look at immigration once a year. Are quotas right? Are we bringing in the right people? Just how is the system working? That's a good start, because up until now, immigration is something we've looked at every 20 years. At least now we're going to talk about it every year. But that first year, we're going to realize that we've got to do some things, because there is no way that we can keep this economy going if we don't have enough workers to help us. The 11 million undocumented, that's the third problem. And this is the one that takes up all the news. This is the one that takes up all the debate. Some people will say the reason we have 11 million undocumented is because we don't have enough border security. Send the unmanned aerial planes to the border and build that fence. It's 300 feet, get 500 feet. But that's what we have to do to have a good immigration system. I'll tell you, if we are 100% successful in sealing our border and sealing our overstays of visas, but we don't change our system, then God help us. Then we're going to see what a real recession is like. And that's the part where, I don't know if people don't get it, or because it's not rocket science, or they just don't want to get it. And the idea of just saying, secure the border, is a very easy soundbite. And it's a very easy place to be. But if you're in business and you want to grow, and you're looking at where do I get the people I need and the right skill set to grow, you're not looking at it that way. You look at it a lot broader than that. Again, the fact is that the system is flawed. The system doesn't work. In '86, when we had that so-called amnesty, what we did not do was change the system. So I hate to think what the economy would be like if we didn't have the 11 million undocumented. I hate to say that, but that's a reality. Everybody's talked about, we're not going to mass deport 11 million people, but we're also not going to hand them a passport. So the solution is somewhere in the middle. And it's not amnesty, it's background checks, it's a fine, not everyone's going to qualify. And the idea is to give people a path to legalization. The big debate in D.C. is whether there's a path to citizenship. Now, the Senate bill is 13 years. The House bill, I understand, is about 15 years. But that's the big debate. Is there a path to citizenship or is there not a path to citizenship? In 1986, when President Reagan did his reform, I mean, that was a very easy thing to do to get a green card. Only 41% chose to become US citizens. And it was pretty easy, 41%. A lot of the folks who stay here would like to go back home and then come back to the US and work part-time, work for 6 months, but they can't. Because they know that if they leave, they can't get back in. So we've got all these unintended consequences and all this complexity because of the system we have in place. I'm going to make one political statement here. Hopefully it's the only one. There have been people who have said that if there isn't a path to citizenship, they're going to veto the bill. Now, personally, I'm fine with a path to citizenship. It's a 13, 15-year wait. It's a big decision. A lot of folks are not going to do it. But to deny 11 million people the opportunity to be legal, the peace of mind to leave their house in the morning and know that they're going to come back at night because you don't get your way on the path to citizenship, what does that say? What we want from those 11 million is their vote. So make them citizens as quickly as possible. I thought what we wanted was to make them legal because they've contributed and they, you know, we think that it's time to do that. That's just something to watch out for. But I'd be very disappointed if this administration vetoed a bill because it didn't include this clear path to citizenship. It's one of those political issues that have nothing to do with the strategic purpose of immigration, which is the economy. Let me just close by saying we need to regain confidence. We've been through a tough time the last, you know, since 9/11. It's just been an awful time from the standpoint of how we feel about national security and how we feel about people who come in from the outside and how we feel about immigrants. It's not the same. It's not the first time that we have felt this way, and it won't be the last time. But xenophobia is fear, and we have nothing to fear because we've proven for 230 years that no matter who comes to this country, they want to be Americans. And over time, they become Americans. You know, the notion that, my gosh, they're going to come here and they're not going to speak English. The problem is that the kids come here and the only language they speak is English. So we're a nation of one language. The Chinese can read our marketing plans, we can't read theirs. So, you know, this idea of that people don't assimilate, people don't integrate, people come here and they become Americans. I spent a lot of time in New York, and it's just amazing how everybody has a different accent, but they're all New Yorkers. And they're all fighting and adding vitality and adding energy and adding, you know, hunger to the economy of that city. So what I would say is, look, if we don't get this right, if we get this wrong, shame on us, because we're supposed to know how to do this. If we get this right, the 21st century is ours. Nobody will catch up to us. And I hope you'll be part of the effort to make sure we get it right. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome former U.S. Representative and NBC analyst Harold Ford Jr.
Thank you. Great speech, Mr. Secretary. There are a number of questions that have come from the audience, but let me just pick up before I go to the very first question from the audience. You made the political point at the end, and you talked a little bit about race. How much do you think the idea of race plays into the political calculus from both parties? I think one could argue that, looking at the last presidential campaign and some of the comments that came from the Republican side, that there might have been a more hostile attitude from the national narrative, at least, from Republicans versus Democrats. But put that aside for one moment. Do you think race is playing a pivotal, pernicious role in this conversation? And if so, how do we mitigate it?
I think it's hard to say. You know, who knows what's in the hearts and minds of people. There are some people who have a problem with illegal immigration, and I think that's a valid concern. If it's a problem about immigration, then I think that's an even bigger concern. Then it's xenophobia. I'll tell you, I spent a lot of time in D.C. In the D.C. area, D.C., Virginia, Maryland, there are about 150,000 Ethiopians. And they are taking over the city. They all have bags under their eyes because they're working 20 hours a day. You ask them, how do you like the U.S.? Oh, it's a tough place. You got to work very hard. But you know what? We love it here because we're free to dream and we're free to go after the dreams. That's what immigration does. And it's added a tremendous vitality to Washington, D.C. and the surrounding areas. So I would say, again, it's confidence. Let's have confidence in this magic place that is America that we've created that enables people to come here and they can do things here that they can't do back in their native land. So I don't know how much is race. I hope it's very little.
There was a question from the audience that spoke to some of the great advantages of Detroit, the low cost of living, the housing stock, the entrepreneurial spirit that exists. Would you be open, or do you think Congress might be open to ideas that would allow for bigger immigrant pools, particularly the entrepreneurial types, the high skill types, if we force them to come to cities like Detroit, as Detroit reinvents and reimagines and rebuilds itself, and for that matter, other cities across the country that are undergoing similar rebuilding and reinventions?
I think it's a great question. You know, Detroit, with 25% decline in population, you're not going to grow. The Migration Policy Institute just came out with a study that actually suggested that states try some things, that we have some tests going on in some states. Michigan would be great to try an immigration policy that suits Chicago. And I'm talking, you know, surgically, what skills do we need? Why don't we, there's a new visa, by the way, for business startups. Why don't we make it really easy for those startups to come to Detroit? I'm sure, you know, agriculture is still very, very large in Michigan and the surrounding areas of Detroit. I'm sure that there's a lack of workers in agriculture. So yes, immigration can be a big part of the solution in Detroit. And depending on the kind of skills that we bring forward, it could be a huge revitalization. I mean, this could be where the startups start because we're attracting immigrants to come to Detroit instead of going someplace else.
It's an interesting point. There are a number of states. I live in New York now, and we have a mayoral race underway, and some of the candidates for mayor making the case that perhaps we need local rules or local laws around immigration. Obviously, there are efforts around other social policy issues. But do you think if Congress is unable to act or unwilling to act for whatever reason, you've touched on some of the political pressures, primary challenges in both parties, do you believe that local and state governments ought to have the autonomy and ability to act, and perhaps Congress will follow that leadership if Chicago's and Detroit's and New York's are to lead?
That's what happened after we lost the bill in 06, 07, is you started having states having their own policies. So you had some states like Arizona go one way. You had some states where, you know, immigrants were welcome, even though they would be they were undocumented. So I think that's, I would hate to think about a country with 50 immigration laws. I mean, not even Europe, you know, has different immigration laws, or trying to get one law throughout Europe. So I would hate to see it go that way, although if we don't get a bill, that's probably where we'll end up.
I know my good friend and old colleague, Freddie Upton, is Chairman Upton. I call him Freddie. Forgive me, Congressman Upton, for being too familiar. But Chairman Upton is in the room. Perhaps other local leaders across the state are listening. We are short on time, Mr. Secretary. I wanted to just run down a few things to get some quick responses from you. You mentioned a few names and perhaps a few issues, and to get a yay or nay and perhaps a quick reaction. Simpson Bowles, the grand bargain, that proposal idea by the former senator and former chief of staff, Democrat, Republican. Should it act as a starting point or perhaps a middle point, or is it a good enough end point for a big bargain?
I think it's a good starting point. you're asking for one word. I would have said
I'll give you a few words.
But sure, I mean, that's what they were supposed to do is
if you were a United States Senator and there was a question from the audience asking, would you come back to Michigan and run for the U.S. Senate? But if you were a member of the U.S. Senate for Michigan, would you vote in favor of the Paul Ryan plan?
I tend to favor a realistic approach to entitlements, which is what Ryan does. And this is where, again, politics get into the way. I think Paul Ryan wants to save Medicare. I really do. I believe that what he wants to do is in order to save a program that has a net present value of about negative $50 trillion. But because saving Medicare requires changing it as we know it, this guy doesn't like Medicare. He wants to take it away from our seniors. So not doing anything, is that going to save Medicare? And this is sort of the political back and forth that we have today. But I would lean, I trust Paul Ryan.
If you were a member of the U.S. Senate, would you have voted for the background check bill that came before that eventually did not get a vote because they were unable to bring closure to it in the Senate? But would Michigan have enjoyed a yea or nay on that vote from Senator Gutierrez?
The background check on?
In the gun reform legislation, calling for universal background check.
Yes, I'm going to confess, okay? I am a Republican. I believe in the Second Amendment. The first thing Fidel Castro did when he took over Cuba is take away the right to bear arms. But if we have background checks in retail stores, why not have them in gun shows? That's all that bill was. So it seemed to me that I think we missed an opportunity to show that we can all be reasonable.
There's great talk about the Republican Party and its revitalization. You worked for the last Republican president, dubbed, as Sandy said so well, his intro, as the big thinker, big mind behind it. I thank you as someone from Memphis for what Kellogg has done in my city. But the party's trying to reinvent itself a lot like Detroit is. There are 2 or 3 names that crop up, one up in the Northeast, Chris Christie. Down south, Jeb Bush from Florida, and even Marco Rubio from Florida as well. Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, Christie, how do you rank them in terms of people being able to reinvent the Republican Party?
I think they're all very talented people.
And obviously, the governor spoke earlier today.
I personally have a great deal of respect for Jeb Bush. He did a great job in Florida, and I think he'd do a great job. My sense of the party, for whatever it's worth, is that at the core, we are right. This idea of free enterprise, smaller government, let people keep more of their money, have less intrusive government, support business, celebrate financial success, all of those great things that I believe are at the core of the Republican Party. If we compare that core versus the other core, I think results will show that the Republican core can win and will win. The problem is that the core has been overshadowed by things on the periphery. So in the middle of a presidential campaign, we have somebody like Todd Akin say something that is just unbelievable, and he becomes a spokesperson for the Republican Party. So maybe I look at it from the standpoint of a business person, but I think at our core we are right, and the more we emphasize the core, the better off we'll be. And I think we have to do a little bit less of finger wagging at people and less about what we are against and more about what we are for.
Along those lines, playing politics for one moment, what's the most positive thing you think Barack Obama's done as president? And I'd love you to contrast it with what you believe the worst, and I don't mean in a personal way, but just the worst policy. I'm talking policy. The best policy that the president's put forward and has been passed, and the worst policy you believe over the last 5 years, 4.5 years since he's been president.
I think that the president has been wise to follow some of the existing foreign policy direction that that we had with certain governments, Middle East, not pull out so quickly out of Afghanistan, Iraq. I think he has shown some wisdom. I believe, and I didn't want to be political, I said that up there. I think that his biggest mistake will be the Affordable Care Act. And
the Health Care Act.
What people call Obamacare. I think that will come back to haunt us. In my nightmares, I look down 10 years from now and I see lower quality hospitals, fewer students going into medicine, fewer innovations in drugs, and fewer innovations in medical devices, and overall lower quality of care, and somehow somebody in the centralized place deciding what my health care needs to be or should be. I think that is, and you know, ironically, he did it in his first 18 months, and most CEOs make their biggest mistakes in their first 18 months. But I think that's one.
So foreign policy, you give him higher grades on, and how he's handled some of national security, and on the health care, you'd give the just to capture.
Yeah, and I think there's so much more that can be done to grow the economy. We haven't had one free trade agreement in the last 4 years. We have the Keystone Pipeline that's sitting there staring us in the face. We can be the Saudi Arabia of the world in 10 years. What are we doing about it? You know, why do we have the inclination to talk about creating jobs, but we've got this pipeline staring us in the face and we're not making the call? I mean, we've got all this oil sitting under our land and we're still importing oil. So there legislation, regulations. Every business I talk to is up to here with new regulations, whether it be environmental, new labor regulations, more paperwork. I mean, either we're for business or we're against business, but it seems like businesses have a tough time competing with competitors, other companies, China, et cetera. And now we've got to compete with government regulations. I mean, you know, it comes down to, do you believe or do you not believe? And I get the impression sometimes from the administration that there isn't a core belief that business is a good thing.
Final question. You touched on the core of the party, Republican, being good and strong, and if their ideas get out, people will react. You became the youngest CEO of Kellogg in 99, 2000. You made the most daring move, a transformative move for the company, purchasing Keebler when some suggested it might not have been the right thing to do, but you did it. Transformational. If you were advising Chris Christie, if he's the nominee, or Jeb Bush, or Marco Rubio, Paul Ryan, not to leave any Republican out, what would be the thing today is if someone were to come to you, one of those four, say, I want to run for president, what's the most transformational thing they can do, not just for the party, but for the country as well as they present ideas, in addition to immigration reform?
I mean, if I had to pick one, I would say energy. I mean, this shale oil discovery and our ability to do horizontal drilling and fracking, which has developed this bad reputation, is a real game changer. We have all this natural gas. I mean, we are the Saudi Arabia of natural gas. We can have certain vehicles run on natural gas. So imagine the converting all of the gas stations in the country to be able to provide natural gas to trucks or buses, the pipelines to get the gas there, the gas that we can export. It's a game changer. All of a sudden, you know, the reliance on the Middle East is gone. And then we North America, because we need Canada and Mexico, we, North America, become the energy leaders of the world. That is viable. That's realistic. That's right in front of us.
Ladies and gentlemen, Secretary Carlos Gutierrez.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
That was good.
You were great.
Good. Thank you.